In Afghanistan, we saw almost immediately after the United States leaving peace, a level of peace that Afghanistan had not experienced in 40 years, breaking out. Extraordinary. That's not going to happen in these countries.
Hello and welcome to the More Freedom Foundation podcast. I am Murray McElhone, making sure the podcast gets uploaded. And joining me is Robert Morris, who makes sure the podcast has content. How are you this week?
I'm doing all right. Just finished a long-awaited video on Peter Zeihan, which has taken a lot out of me, but I'm excited to talk about some stuff that actually matters instead of a critique of some random geopolitics guy.
It's a part of the world, I'm sure he had some very accurate predictions that we may talk about at a later date.
Yeah, the extent to which Peter Zeihan does not know about the stuff that we're going to talk about today is, I would assume, quite large, which is actually kind of ironic because it actually supports some of his ideas in some ways. I would argue not enough to make it matter, but it is about U.S. withdrawal. That is the topic of what will we be discussing today.
So today we'll be talking about how America is leaving Africa, particularly Niger.
Niger, I think, is the...
Niger. Okay.
That's the way we do it.
Some people would call it Niger.
Yeah, that is... There's definitely...
Like a shortened version of Nigeria.
There are a variety of choices, variety of approaches, but I think Niger is sort of the established one. My pronunciation is typically terrible.
From what I understand, the Americans were here originally because of something America, France, and Britain did, which comes up in our show a lot, which is the fall of Libya.
Exactly. That is the genesis of the sort of nightmare that the Sahel region has been going through. Today we're going to be talking about a number of countries that it's honestly difficult to even get reporting on. They are the Sahel, I believe, is a derivative of an Arabic word that means coast or something, but it's not the coast of a sea. It is the coast of the Sahara.
Yes.
These are countries like Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, Chad.
So I think it's where you start to get vegetation and life. It's not just sheer desert.
Yes. And this particular region was absolutely inundated with weapons and militia members when the United States and France and the UK decided to take out Libya. This is sort of the genesis of this heavy U.S. presence. The French, of course, had always been there. Their military presence stepped up in the aftermath of the destruction of Libya. Very quickly, Mali fell to these groups of militias, which at that point and still today, a lot of these insurgent groups associate themselves with jihad and radical versions of Islamic thought. Quickly took over the country in 2012, and the first and really only victory this U.S.-French occupation operation, whatever you want to call it, could point to was rolling back those militias in 2012 and restoring some form of legitimate governance to much of Mali. I was seeing someone mentioning that also Niger was, stability was maintained in Niger. Militias were rolled back to some degree in 2012, 2013 or thereabouts. That was a decade ago. And over the decade that has ensued, insurgents, jihadist militias, whatever you want to call them, that sort of activity has only increased across the region, despite the fact that the United States and France were both digging in to higher and higher degrees over the course of the past decade. I believe under the French thing was called Operation Barkhane or something along those lines. That sort of collapsed a couple years back. And over the course of the past 4 years or so, we've seen a coup wave across the Sahel that has demolished what little democracy you could find in the region. I would never want to try to tell people that these were impeccable or impressive governments, but they were countries that were attempting to comport themselves in a somewhat representative manner.
It reminds me a little of our last episode when we were talking about Afghanistan, and you had the analogy about this woman that was going to be forced to marry her brother-in-law, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And under Sharia law, that wasn't allowed. And while I definitely don't think Afghanistan's the best government, I feel a government is better than no government. And I think this is maybe what's being reflected here, or was, sadly.
The coup dynamics are, certainly all of the folks who are carrying out those coups are talking about security. They're talking about, we have utterly failed over the past decade to maintain any kind of, even continuity of government across the territories of these countries. And do they have a point? Maybe. But I think it is relevant, it is worth pointing out that the genesis of all of these governments is militaries that the United States has heavily funded over the past decade.
I just want to give a little bit of context about not necessarily the money involved, but we are dealing with some of the poorest countries in the world. When you sort of think stereotypical African poverty, a lot of Niger would reflect that stereotype. So when you consider, we'll be talking about the special forces and stuff that come in, but they may as well be like spacemen or aliens coming down with the amount of technology and money that they'll just be wearing and then be able to throw around would make, anyone even in a wealthy country blush. So the amount of money they're able to just sort of vomit and put across this place completely disrupts it and terrifies everybody.
Absolutely. And I think that's a key point of the incredible disappointment experienced in these countries. Okay, these are some of the richest countries in the world. France, the historic colonial hegemon, the United States, they're the most powerful country in human history. They come down with their helicopters, their special forces, their drone bases, this, that, and the other thing, the highest technology for destruction imaginable.
I think
things just get worse.
Airbase 201 costs 100 million, for example, which is just an outstanding amount of money for such an impoverished nation.
Well, there's different estimates as to how much that drone base cost. I've seen 100 million. I've seen $250 million, like this is the one in Niger.
Wow.
Yeah, a full $250 million spent on the drone base in Niger. So all of this is a sort of setting up background to what happened about, I guess it'll be just 2 weeks ago, 2 weekends back. This should be published next Monday. What happened was the United States agreed, I guess this is sort of April 19th or thereabouts. This was reported in the Washington Post. The United States agreed to leave, which is a phenomenal thing. We've had this ongoing series of coups over the past number of years in the Sahel. I think there's been 4 coups in Burkina Faso, 3 coups in Mali, 1 in Niger, 1 in Chad, 1 in Guinea. Sudan, which is, of course, getting a little bit out of the region we're talking about here, but it certainly neighbors it, is immersed in a horrific civil war. Libya is in a endless low-level civil war.
It's one country away.
And of course, Mali and Burkina Faso, I believe, are in this unique set of countries that have both managed to have 2 coups in a 12-month period. So in less than a year, both of them have experienced 2 separate coups. So it's been a disaster. And what is so significant about what happened on April 19th is that Niger was the last bastion, described in a Wall Street Journal article, I think towards the end of 2022, as the firewall. This is where the United States was going to do this incredibly important, incredibly vital work of fighting jihadists. This is where the war on terror was going to keep on going. We were very pleased with Mohamed Bazoum. He was the much more democratic-looking leader of Niger. This is why we were investing so much in Niger. This is why we were willing to build a $250 million drone base. This is why we had all these troops here. We were going to be there forever. And then, a scant 6 or 7 months after that Wall Street Journal article was published, there was a coup. July 26, 2023, yet another coup junta that comes out of a military that the United States has heavily funded. And relationship was very up in the air. I mean, there's been a coup in Burkina Faso. The United States has not been barred from that country, but I think sort of part of as is becoming rather a large dynamic right now, there are limitations, legal limitations on what the United States can do with governments that are committing human rights violations, with governments that are run by illegitimate coup-oriented governments. So the United States, part of it was Mali and Burkina Faso didn't really want the United States around, but also within the U.S. structure, there are incentives, actually not incentives, strictures stating that we can't deal with those kinds of governments. So from July of 2023 until March of 2024, there was some ambiguity, there was going back and forth. The United States was in one of those very grim sets of circumstances where the administrative apparatus is doing everything it can to avoid calling what happened what had actually happened. We're seeing that a lot in the context of Israel and Gaza, where the State Department is currently sitting on pretty solid confirmations of human rights violations by Israel because, obviously the United States is going to keep funding Israel. So when Burkina Faso fell in a coup, when Mali, had its two coups, the United States could sort of afford to be kind of snippy about it because there were other options. There were other sort of governments left that we could choose to work with. With Niger, that's pretty much the region. Chad also had a coup in 2021, kind of a weird one. Essentially, the president of Chad was killed in fighting. It's not something that often happens. Heads of state getting killed, and then his son, despite there being plenty of constitutional folks in succession, his son took over. So that's what happened in Chad. So basically, the United States trying desperately to hold on to this incredibly large investment we had made in Niger. And beyond that, and I think this is the important bit here, this is why this is worth doing a whole episode on. This was our United States Africa policy. This was the fight against jihad. This was what was in Niger was the battered remnants of George W. Bush and Barack Obama's war on terror policy.
Are we seeing an end to this I forget the correct name for it, but the idea was instead of sending in thousands of normal soldiers, you could just send in a handful of, super special elite super soldiers, and they would do some incredible James Bond carry-on and destroy the super baddie. So you can save a lot of money and you have significantly less deaths. Are we seeing an end to this policy, or will it just transform?
Well, we should be seeing an end to this policy. We're not, of course. I think there's a variety of ways of looking at this. The Special Forces model, my understanding is actually most of what Special Forces do is not go in behind enemy lines and find the terrorist and assassinate the terrorist. They definitely do that sort of thing. They definitely do a fair amount of secret stuff or what have you. But in the reporting to government agencies, and I think, in fact, most of what Special Forces do is go all around the world and train other militaries. That's a means through which U.S. empire goes everywhere. If you just look at like the CENTCOM news releases, there'll be stuff about missions in countries that we have supposedly no bases in. They're like, our trainers are in Uzbekistan or this, that, and the other thing. And that's a lot of what Special Forces do is travel around the world training other militaries. And I think the Sahel is an incredible example of what a terrible idea that is. I'm not saying that it's always a bad thing to train militaries. The Pentagon will tell you, well, the main thing they're training these militaries in is in humanitarianism and respect for democracy or what have you, which is obviously hogwash. The main thing they are training is...
Because I can see here Tunisia is a place in Africa that they're still, training military personnel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that's another great example of a country where we trained up the military. There was a decade of democracy in Tunisia, And the only money we were willing to give that democracy was for the military. That ended up supporting a coup that destroyed the sole example of Arab democracy after the Arab Spring. So while it would be great if the Pentagon, if SOCOM, if the U.S. Congress would look at this incredible legacy of failure where billions upon billions of dollars were spent in this region over the past 20 years and the only thing it produced was military coups, it would be great if there was some rethinking of the Special Forces military-first model. And to answer your question more briefly, I don't think there's any question that, or there is any appetite to go from using Special Forces back to a broader, we're going to come in and occupy and run the place. The United States is no longer interested in that sort of thing. But there should be, I think, a switch away from the military-first model. So I think it's amazing that the Biden administration agreed to leave. I'm honestly kind of surprised. If you just remember how obliterated they were leaving Afghanistan. This is comparable. Obviously, we haven't had the loss of life. We haven't had the broader public investment in this Sahel project.
I think there was still a small number of Special Forces soldiers killed, and I think there was a whole mix-up where one soldier they thought was still alive and had told the family that they were in negotiations to have a prisoner swap, and actually he was dead and stuff, which caused a lot of upset and controversy. But yeah, definitely significantly less deaths in this scenario.
Yeah, that was 2017, right, when the four Special Forces were killed, and Lindsey Graham, the
where people suddenly realized how many troops.
Yeah, Lindsey Graham, the Republican Senate hawk of all hawks, big war guy, was like, we have troops in Niger. Just the fact that foreign policy centered Congress people couldn't keep track of this. I do want to qualify something very quickly. This does not mean that the United States is done in Africa. We are done in this region of Africa with a particularly stupid set of policies. We're still very much involved in Somalia very deeply, bombing. It's an open question the degree to which the United States is involved in Sudan or Ethiopia, but these are very active war zones. We reserve the same rights we've been reserving for the past 20 years. To sort of drop in Special Forces to, kill people we've decided need to be killed or what have you. But the long-term, we're helping these countries fight off jihadists mission that was such an extraordinary failure, that does appear to be kind of over. And that is a fantastic thing. And it is a switch. It is a shift on the level of getting out of Afghanistan. This is another 20-year-old failed policy.
So I think troops were kicked out of, or are going to be leaving Chad as well. Is that right?
That was kind of a surprise. Chad is, I don't, how to put this. Chad is a less formal, less organized kind of place than Niger is. It was run by a father was he there for 30 years or something like that? He was killed in battle, and now his son runs the place. Apparently, I think as sort of a pile-on in a much less formal way, there was sort of a letter from Chad saying, get the heck out. And the U.S. government was kind of like, I guess, I don't know. Sure. And that's apparently, there's ongoing negotiations there, apparently. Perhaps Chad was realizing, now the U.S. is looking for somewhere to go, and we can reap more benefits out of this. But the Niger thing is key.
So I think it was up to 1,000 U.S. troops there. Like, it is a sizable amount of soldiers.
Exactly. We had that drone base with the $250 million drone base, and it was marked over the past 4 or 5 years that the troop levels in Niger just kept rising and rising and rising. That was clearly a very important place.
I think the airport there was quite impressive. Just I heard, I don't know exactly, I think because it's the Air Force and not the Army building it, they refer to it as the largest military labour project in Air Force history, which I thought was interesting. So like a lot of money's been hemorrhaged into this place.
Oh yeah, a ton. And it is kind of fascinating that Biden administration has not been given that hard a time about this. I still maintain that Biden and Trump deserve a joint Nobel Peace Prize for getting us out of Afghanistan. But if you talk to anybody in the United States, they'll give you this standard, maybe we should have left, but we did it the wrong way, or which is a sort of standard line, standard approach.
It's sort of I don't know what's the best way to leave a disaster.
There is no good way. And frankly, like it's a kind of ridiculous meme because it's like assuming that like, well, was Joe Biden going to like personally be flying transport planes or something? Like Joe Biden and the president before him had both given orders years ahead of time to the military to facilitate getting out of Afghanistan. That's the job of the president. That's the job of the commander-in-chief, to say, military, do this, and to give them adequate time to do it. They had 2 years to plan a decent withdrawal from Afghanistan. Joe Biden got into office, said, hey, guys, what's the plans? Like, oh, we just assumed we wouldn't do that when you got elected. It's essentially a kind of mutiny, I think, against both Donald Trump and Joe Biden, that this was poorly handled. And the fact that Joe Biden is blamed for this instead of the legions of very well-paid in retirement generals who lied to both the executive branch of the U.S. government and the people that things were somehow going well for 20 years, they get off scot-free. So considering that media environment, it's kind of surprising that nobody's talking about this rather huge end of 20 years of U.S. policy, or at least a decade of U.S. policy in the Sahel specifically. And I sort of thought about it, and I looked into it a little bit, Ray, and I think the reason is because there's no hook. There's nothing good that this program provided. In Afghanistan,
I think it's also the fact so few people know about it.
Yeah. And it's such a cataclysmic failure on every metric. This is from The Intercept, and it uses sort of two different data sources, so I don't really like it. And it also doesn't include that detail of us destroying Libya, the economic linchpin of the region, in 2011. But anyway, this is from The Intercept. During 2002 and 2003, according to the State Department, terrorists caused just 23 casualties in all of Africa. Last year, according to the Africa Center for Strategic Studies, the Defense Department Research Institution, attacks by Islamist militants in the Sahel alone resulted in 11,643 deaths, a more than 50,000% increase.
Terrifying.
Yeah, and you can begin to get the sense of the rage of the people in these countries. The United States is essentially just moving in, and after a decade of complete failure, it was like, well, we'll just build this big airport and this big project so we can maintain, because of all the success we've been having, we're just going to continue this process. We're just going to continue doing this. And that was not well received. In Afghanistan, we had a small class of urban women that really relied upon us, that we screwed over. You can have a lot of good stories about that. We had interpreters. We had people who'd worked for us in the Afghan government for 2 decades who were getting screwed over, who you could tell really heartrending stories about. The stakeholders, our stakeholders, like the interpreters, the Afghan women, the analogs in the Sahel, are the militaries that did all the coups and are kicking us out. So it's all. Additionally, most journalists, not most journalists, but a lot of journalists, especially journalists who are now at the prime of their careers in their mid-40s, are news anchors, are running, well, what's left of the journalism industry in the United States. All of them sort of cut their teeth in Afghanistan. They went and did a year or two. They made a movie out of it with Tina Fey and Margot Robbie. Just sort of living in Afghanistan and being journalists and this, that, and the other thing. So all of them had a visceral connection to people and places that were being given up. The journalistic coverage, I ran a video about this about a year and a half ago, just talking about how nightmarishly bad the coverage of this region was. There just wasn't any coverage. Essentially every 2 years or so, the Wall Street Journal or The Economist would, maybe even as a cover story, would run a whole bunch of Pentagon stenography. The Defense Department tells us that jihad's new front is in the Sahel. this, that, and the other thing. So there's just no idea what was going on there.
Because most of the footage you see is either from the American military or the French military. There's, as you say, there's very little journalists on the ground here doing any sort of research.
And unlike Afghanistan, where in urban environments anyway, there's at least a large middle class that has phones that can document things, that is less the case. I mean, my understanding is that most folks in these countries have phones as well, but perhaps they can't take footage. They're not fully capable smartphones, that sort of thing.
And quite often they have phones, but they're not really connected to the internet, so they're just using them as calculators or cameras and that sort of thing.
So there just isn't any kind of story other than what the Defense Department was telling us. It's entirely possible no, it's not possible. It is now known quite strongly that a variety of horrific things were happening there. Did we do a full episode on this, or I feel like we must have discussed it, but this is Nigeria, not Niger, the titan of the region, which is probably experienced more horrific violence than all of these places, because there are, I believe, now over 200 million people in Nigeria. Massive country, massive oil wealth.
Well, just to give a comparison, the difference between these two countries, so Nigeria, the titan, it makes around 472 billion a year, while Niger makes 15.
So that's GDP figures?
Yes.
Yeah. So
it's just it's a colossus in comparison.
Yeah. So we got a really detailed, horrifying series of reports. I can't recall if it was Reuters or the Associated Press, but if you just Google Nigerian nightmare, I believe it comes up. And just the Nigerian military is obviously very self-supported through a large oil industry, but also gets a lot of support and training and help from the U.S. military, and is guilty of a series of absolutely horrific human rights abuses, picking up women who had been kidnapped by Islamist militias and forcing them to have abortions, sometimes without their knowledge, large-scale murder of children, wiping out whole villages, just nasty stuff that, of course, the Nigerian government denies up and down. But this is a fairly serious old-line U.S. news institution. I can't remember if it was the AP or Reuters that did a multi-part series on how disgustingly abusive the Nigerian military is. There has been sort of an attempt to start to get people complaining about this and talking about this, but within the first week after the U.S. withdrawal from Niger, I don't believe this withdrawal has actually happened yet, but the U.S. agreement that there will be a withdrawal from Niger, people who were attempting to build a bit of an Afghanistan-style fervor about this had to deal with the most recent news out of the Sahel, which was that the Burkinabe military, Burkina Faso, this is one of the countries in the Sahel, there were credible reports that last February, this very U.S.-supported military massacred 400 people in a couple of villages. So, even as we were leaving, even if anybody really wanted to create a fervor or a series of complaints about this, the news just was so horrible that kept coming out that it made it kind of impossible. It is such a good thing that we are no longer there.
You think this is a classic case of mission creep? Because it seemed to be a very vague goal, which is basically terrorism bad. There's some terrorists in the region and we'll just send in special forces and drones until the terrorism goes away. But there was no real end goal in sight, and it's just well, here's another couple of billion, here's another couple of billion. Slowly things just seem to add up, and now it just feels like, we might have to fight China in the South China Sea in a couple of years, so we're getting a wee bit bored of all this.
Well, I think the specific that drone base indicated that the complete failure of the basic mission, have countries be more firmly in control, fewer militias, fewer deaths. Despite that complete failure, the United States just seemed to want to keep doubling down. And I think the impression that it gave, certainly the impression that I got, was, yeah, we just want to keep doing this forever. This is a great drone testing range. And these countries are so poor and their administrative capacity is so low that it's almost like these countries are being eaten away from both directions. You've got the insurgents who are generally called Islamist militants or jihadists, but I think that sort of oversimplifies things. I think it's actually much more likely that it's state failure in these countries. It's ethnic conflicts. I certainly know that's the case in Nigeria, where a lot of ethnic conflict gets sort of, or a conflict between farmers and pastoral peoples is sort of, it's all religion. It's not really just religion. But anyway, so you've got these militias on the bottom, and then you've got the U.S. up top, just sort of sinking in further and further. And both of these entities are not actually interested in state power and functioning states in the middle. They both just sort of want to bomb each other. It's some question, I'm not sure many would agree, what was the greater enemy to the functioning of these states? The militias, the encroaching militias, or the United States? I do think it's worth emphasizing that none of these battles are going to end here. In Afghanistan, we saw almost immediately after the United States leaving peace, a level of peace that Afghanistan had not experienced in 40 years, breaking out. Extraordinary. That's not going to happen in these countries. Things have been very seriously broken by that initial NATO invasion of Libya, by the sort of failed ham-handed attempts of the U.S., France, and U.S. and French trained militaries to crush these movements that have only made them grow. There are serious problems. Also, I don't believe that any of these militias are particularly likely to have success again. I haven't seen much about cities being besieged by these militants. I don't think. Actually, there might have been one in one of these countries.
But also, America just seemed to have significantly less control in the region. They seem like they kind of destroyed small bits, but there isn't really the whole, collapse of them leaving that might result in peace. It just feels almost just like they're just another gang in town and now they're gone.
I think that's really important. They are just another gang in town and now they're gone. But what's worse about it is that they're a gang that has an interest in continued warfare. And I think that's the key problem here. And the key problem of our military-first approach to the war on terror more generally is that it is in the institutional interest of the military for these conflicts to continue. And that's what happened. So there's a lot of talk about what this means for the only argument that people who have problems with this have is, well, isn't Russia going to replace us? Aren't we leaving a vacuum in the Sahel for the Russians? You're smiling, but that is absolutely an argument that people are making, an argument that people are putting forward.
I'm also hearing that Russia's going to take over because France is going to slowly, everyone hates France, so the locals will team up with Russia and kick France out.
Yeah, I think that's kind of nonsense. I think that there is no replacing the United States and the uniquely malign influence that the United States has had on this region. The comparison here is that the Russians want to come in and get paid. Like, that's what the Russians are there to make money. The Russians want access to gold mines. The Russians want these very poor governments to pay them.
Very classic European mercenaries, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. So even the Malian government, Niger, you said, had a GDP of 12 billion a year. That still supports a government that can pay for a couple thousand Russian mercenaries for, or something along those lines. So the Russians are there to get paid to do war crimes. They're not going to be funding up militaries. They're not going to be it's a very different set of circumstances. It's not the same
set of events.
Perverse, war maintaining approach that the United States has with the $250 billion drone bases and the militaries that we fund. So it's just different. Like Russia wants to be paid to do war crimes. The United States wants to build militaries that can do war crimes. That's a contrast, and it's really hard for me to say that the Russians are worse than the United States, if that's what's being offered here.
The big worry is?
Yeah. It's not like USAID has been shut out of these countries. It's not like the humanitarian organizations or U.S. diplomacy has been shut out of this region in any meaningful way. In fact, if some of these countries are a little more successful in consolidating, and now that the U.S. is gone, there's probably a broader range of places where U.S. aid and U.S. diplomacy can act. So while in the short term I remain very pessimistic about these countries, I do kind of think that like getting the U.S. war machine out of these countries is a first step towards these conflicts actually being resolved. It's entirely possible that the...
Can you see the French war machine ever leaving?
Well, the French war machine has largely left most of these countries. They've been, when the coup governments come into power, despite the fact that the U.S. probably has poured more money into a lot of these places, I mean, it was different. The French, I think, were the main sort of Western boots on the ground in Mali. Burkina Faso might have been more of a split. Niger was more the U.S. But my understanding is the French have been kicked out of pretty much everywhere in the aftermath of the 2023 coup in Niger. I did read something this morning. It was a couple hundred or maybe even more. It was 1,300 French troops have also left Niger. So the French have largely been sort of booted out, but it's still most of these places. Yeah, well, I did see something kind of interesting that I can't recall if it was Niger or Burkina Faso and I feel terrible because this is probably one of the few. I googled podcasts on these countries and that there just weren't any. But like it's probably some of the what little coverage that the Sahel is going to get in the United States this month, and I can't be bothered to get the actual country right. But I can't remember which one of it was, but it was either Burkina Faso or Niger, I think. They made a big deal about French is no longer going to be our official language. It'll be one of our working languages. But was Russian going to replace that? Of course not. It was replaced by English.
So do we see France finally saying goodbye to its empire and its colonies?
I think probably not. It depends on what you mean. I mean, the French... I think the French still have inordinate power over the currency in these regions. I think their cultural power remains immense. Their diplomatic power remains immense. I think it's important to remember that they didn't have that much. In the first decade of the century, when most of these countries were largely peaceful, the French military didn't have a lot of purchase in these countries. Now, it had a decade of back to the 50s. Or whatever, in terms of the amount of military forces rampaging around. And I think this is a key thing. It's just because our military has left a place, or the French military has left a place, does not mean that the influence of France or the United States has left entirely. There's indications that already there's backlash against some of these Russian mercenaries in some of these countries, because they as well are not a panacea. They're not going to solve all of these problems. But I do want to point to just the way that Russia has been used as an excuse across Africa to justify just really stupid, pointless, wasteful policies. Because we don't want to leave that void. We don't want to. And another example of this, the way that Chinese economic engagement has been used as an excuse to maintain these terrible ongoing military engagements, which is just absurd, really. It's like, well, China's doing a good job developing real influence in these countries. We're going to blow them up more and make people angrier at us. It's absurd.
Theoretically, you'd want, well, I guess maybe it's naive, but you'd want these countries to do well. And if China, let's say the Belt and Road is doing something and they're building a road or two, like, heavens forbid they help the infrastructure of these places. But from what you're saying, America and France would just love for everything to go wrong.
Not consciously, but the kinds of help that the United States has wanted to offer over the past 20 years have been military. And I think the fact that the military problem has gotten worse and worse and worse as we have poured more and more money and resources into the region is significant and worth noticing. I don't see Russia. I mean, if Russia does come in and, 2,000 Russian mercenaries manage to wipe out a problem that the United States had failed to solve for 20 years, I could see Russia gaining in some influence in these regions. And if so, that's our effing fault, But I don't think they're going to have much more success in resolving these issues than we are. I think they're likely to fail and also withdraw, and then eventually negotiation will move forward. Because it is important, this is 10, a solid decade of history here, but there absolutely are examples of the United States and France holding back our government clients from negotiations. So now, after we had failed and the Russians failed, I think some more serious negotiations are become a real possibility.
In a very cynical sense, can you see this as a way that the American military is wanting to test out certain, new technologies and techniques? Like this is they seen this as maybe a nice wee petri dish far away from other influences?
100%. I think that would be why. I mean, how do you spend $250 million on a drone base in Niger if that's not what you're trying to do? It's that much money being spent is definitely an attempt to build new strategies for counterinsurgency and usages of drones and this is all. That's also been the case in Libya. And I don't want to make the further step being like, oh, this is intentional. We're intentionally dragging the war out. We're intentionally destroyed Libya so we could try out all these strategies. No, I don't think that's the case. I don't think that's the case at all. But I do think that the incentives that are built around the wars continuing are worth paying attention to. And it's not a conscious decision made by sinister CIA planners or the Pentagon being like, yeah, let's screw over the natives or no. And then I don't think nothing is that conscious or sinister. It's just a variety of tools that don't work for the mission. What you need for the mission of peace and stability and development in this region is diplomatic resources, not a bunch of effing drones. But all we want to apply is a bunch of effing drones. And the problem doesn't get solved. But yeah, there's new doctrines, new strategies, new equipment has absolutely been tried out in this battle space to absolutely nobody's benefit other than defense contractors, which is another reason why I'm really okay with this being over.
What can you see as a positive aspect for the Sahel region with this?
Jesus, that's a tough question. It's in part it's a confirmation that they probably have to rely on themselves, which is a tragedy. I'm not someone who's like, oh yeah, these countries should look after themselves. They emphatically should not. These countries have been deeply screwed over by Europe and now deeply screwed over by the United States. We owe them big. We absolutely should be providing development and this, that, and the other thing. But unfortunately, we are not. We are only bringing more destruction. And I think that it's clear from the communications of these coup juntas that they've kind of learned that lesson, a lesson that they knew already, but it just to have it reinforced again. And I think the French influence is not wiped out by any means, but it is lessened significantly. And I think that's definitely a good thing. The French, I don't believe, had ongoing military presence in too many of these countries in the first decade of the century. But always, whenever there was any kind of problem, the answer was, and there'd be enough people in the local country that would be in positions of power to invite the French back in. They were the solution if there was some kind of problem. It was the French military was the solution. And I think the fact that solution has been discredited is a very good thing. The fact that the United States AFRICOM in yet another region has shown that actually we're not that useful is a good thing. And I think that's a lesson that these countries have learned. The important question is, has the U.S. taxpayer learned this lesson sufficiently? Have decision makers in the United States learned this lesson sufficiently? Or is it simply that, as you pointed out earlier, like, well, we've got a Taiwan war to fight and we've got some more Israel bombs to buy, just moving on. But I do think I think it's good that a country has asked us to leave, and we're leaving. It's an indication of just how terribly failed this mission has been. But I think that's a good positive step. That's a nice thing to see the United States do. I think Iraq has asked us to leave on multiple occasions. I think the Parliament, has asked us to leave. Presidents have asked us to leave.
But that's a much larger investment, Rob. You can't be pulling out of there.
Yeah, good point. And we're still freaking there. So it is nice. It is nice to see. It is nice to. I was surprised and pleased to see the United States defer to the wishes of a much poorer country. That's something that's positive. Of course, that said, maybe we won't leave. Maybe we are saying we're leaving and then we're just sort of renegotiating. I don't know. But it is...
or move a lot over to Chad.
Well, Chad apparently doesn't want us there either. Of course, or maybe that was just the opening of a negotiation. Who knows? But what's the case? What's the case to be there? The fact that we've jacked up deaths by 50,000%? It's just the fact that all of... our guys are running coup governments. It's strange because it's such a long running conflict that nobody ever really knew anything about. And perhaps there'll be an academic 40, 50 years from now when the archives open, who'll be able to sort of sift through. And my expectation will be that archivist, when he or she opens those records.
I think America should send 1,000 of its best agricultural experts, because I feel that would do a lot more help for this region than military experts.
That does sound nice. Unfortunately, they've got the security of those agricultural experts. But I do feel that
this place could have a lot more food and...
No. I do think there's probably a story to be told in the military records of these cluster bombs of operations, but I don't expect by the time those records are accessible, I think most people will have forgotten that this ever happened, which is a bit grim.
Yes, sadly. So hopefully you'll join us next time as we'll be discussing what Peter Zeihan has gotten right and mostly what he's gotten wrong. So hopefully you'll join us for that episode. The More Freedom Foundation is also available on YouTube and TikTok. Rob's Twitter is RobOLaw, and he's also written a book called Avoiding the British Empire, What It Was and How the US Can Do Better. And music provided by Kevin MacLeod.